For almost 100 years, pirates haunted the seas from Newfoundland to the Straits of Magellan, the Caribbee Isles to the shores of Asia. Sailing under red and black flags, they were free men living under creeds of honor and brotherhood, and waged war upon the sea in quest for gold, glory, leisure, and salvation. These bloody adventures have become so iconic to the age of sail that the mere sight of a wooden vessel is bound to strike up the image of those black-hearted scoundrels, swinging their swords and singing yo-ho. Pirate ship has become ubiquitous with any sail ship built before the Industrial Revolution, sometimes after. It is a bit misleading, since pirates didn't just use any ships, and were somewhat limited in what they preferred. A child might visit the Vasa or the HMS Victory, point at it and announce, "That's a pirate ship." But vessels even remotely of this size would have been nigh impossible for a pirate to acquire, and not really in their interest anyway. Instead, as a rule of thumb, pirates looked for a specific set of properties in the ships they acquired, perfectly tailored to their ambitions, the way in which they operated, and the very lifestyle they lived. They didn't just use any ship, they used pirate ships. So to understand the phenomenon that was the golden age of piracy, we have to understand the pirate ship, the wooden world upon which they lived, breathed, and plundered the seven seas. To understand what properties pirates looked for in their ships, we need to understand piracy in its most basic form: armed robbery at sea. So you can think of the pirate ship as any armed robber, even a mugger, a roadman. They need to be quick on their feet to catch or surprise their victims, and then something like a knife or a gun, or just a big fist, to scare their victim into handing over the purse, or to subdue or kill them should they not comply. But if the victim puts up a fight, or if the police shows up, the robber has to be quick enough to make an escape. These principles can be transferred over to the properties of a pirate ship. It had to be armed and fast. This principle hasn't really changed from the dawn of sailing to today. In antiquity, the favorite ships of the Cilician pirates were Hemioleus and Liburnians, light galleys capable of catching the grain shipments bound from Egypt. Nowadays, the Somalian pirates capture large cargo vessels from tiny speedboats. During the golden age of piracy, things were much the same. There were pirates who were able to capture cargo vessels using only canoes, but there was still a limit to what kind of prizes a canoe could capture, and every pirate ship had such a limit. Again, looking at the armed robber, if he is a scrawny guy with no weapon, he might be able to pull the purse from an old babushka and leg it. But give him a knife, and he might be able to subdue a man bigger than him. Give him a gun, and he can take on Arnold Schwarzenegger. Again, the same applied for pirate ships, but there was the matter of investment. Pirates often had a limited investment pool, as in how much they could invest into their ship and equipment. This brings us to another founding principle of piracy. Now, the ultimate goal of piracy is to make a profit by stealing. If your investment is bigger than the acquisition, then you don't make a profit. So, pirates had to strike a balance between making an appropriate investment for what goals they wanted to achieve. The properties needed of a pirate ship can also be understood by looking at the two other big categories of ship types in the period: merchantmen and men of war. The former were trading and cargo ships, the latter warships employed by state navies. Merchantmen, much like pirate ships, had the goal of making money, but they made it by trading. So, merchantmen had to carry enough cargo to make a profit, be fast enough to deliver the cargo in a profitable time frame, have enough crew to man and defend the ship, and enough weapons to defend the ship. The priority was cargo space, speed, men, and weapons. During the 17th century, cargo ships that could carry as much cargo as possible and needing as few men as possible were preferred. Warships, or men of war as they were called, were paid by the government to defeat the enemy, sink fleets, defend coastlines, and capture cities. Of course, navy captains often made a side income from plunder and illicit trade, but they could never do either as effectively as privateers or merchants. for their main purposes. They needed strong enough ships to resist the enemy, enough firepower to defeat them, enough men to man the ship and fight in combat, and enough speed to move into position and maneuver around the battlefield. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I've incorrectly referred to pirate ships as pirate ships, whereas they should more specifically be understood as privateer ships, or simply privateers, as they were known in the period. Ships were often classified by their purpose. The distinction between privateer ships and pirate ships was small, often negligible. Privateer was an abbreviation of private man of war. These were privately owned ships, commissioned in wartime, usually for commerce raiding. Most pirates during the Golden Age were some sort of privateers, or pretended to be. Therefore, it is more useful to call pirate ships privateers. So as aforementioned, they had to strike a middle ground between men of war and merchantmen, strong enough to subdue the merchants, fast and nimble enough to catch them, and to escape the men of war, all the while striking an economic balance. To explain this, the purpose of a man of war was to win the war, no matter the cost. So make them as big, heavy, and shooty as possible. But the purpose of the privateer was for the private investors to make money. So sure, you can make a super big shooty scary ship, but that will require a huge investment, with a limited chance of a worthwhile profit, provided it isn't defeated by the enemy or sunk in a storm, and you end up with a total loss. Or you could just take a small and quick vessel, slap a few cannons on it, buy a couple of muskets, and wish the boys good luck. Then you haven't spent a lot of money, but could potentially earn 2, 5, 10 times the investment in profit. So in this case, the investors had to find an appropriate balance. How much do we want to risk and invest? So privateers could be anything from essentially a rowboat with a mast, to a full-rigged ship of 40 cannons. But again, compared to merchants and men of war, they all embodied the distinct qualities of being speedier, with the level of armament being relative to merchants and men of war, more or less. In the case of actual pirates that had broken free from legal society, the pirate crew itself were the investors. They were the ones who invested their lives, time and equipment into the venture, and received all of the profits. Their priorities might be slightly different as a result. Their ship would also serve as a mobile base, so if they expected to stay out at sea for long periods, they might want a bigger ship, or even a fleet. I'll talk more about this shortly, but for the most part, pirate and privateer ships weren't too different. There are also the matter of circumstantial, usually environmental properties. This applied to every type of ship. A fishing boat working cod in the Newfoundland banks would be different from a herring bus in Northern Europe. A Dutchman trading in the Baltic would be different from a French East Indiaman. Especially notable were slave ships. These carried trafficked people, tightly packed, susceptible to horrific diseases, meaning that they had to be delivered rapidly across the Atlantic. Slave ships were thus light and speedy, more akin to privateers. So a lot of slave ships were former privateers, or even converted to them. This is why pirates always looked to capture them, and why so many famous pirate ships, like the Bachelor's Delight, Widow, and Queen Anne's Revenge, had been slavers. The same environmental factors applied to pirate ships. The situations were entirely different in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. The Caribbean and the American East Coast are notoriously treacherous, a veritable treasure trove of shipwrecks. Maps were unreliable in the period, especially since the maritime terrain was bound to shift. There were innumerable shallow waters and hidden reefs, upon which an unsuspecting vessel could easily get caught and lost. So any ship operating effectively in this region, pirate or merchant, had to be adapted to this circumstance. Pirates could use the environment to their advantage. They could hide in the many coves and the vast, sparsely inhabited shorelines, escape from pursuers into reefs and shallow waters, and the lighter ships were easier to beach and repair just about anywhere in the islands. In turn, the navy ships designated for pirate hunting also had to be adapted for these environmental tactics. But upon the open ocean, and in regions like the South Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean, and pirates had to cross vast distances, often for long periods without meeting anyone else. So the larger ships that would easily founder in the Caribbean were preferred here. They could carry larger crews, more plunder, and more provisions. In the Caribbean, it was possible for pirates in small ships to basically jump between the islands, or constantly move in and out of a local base. Go on a quick venture, capture a few ships, return, restock, party, and then get out. Another very important and often overlooked property of pirate ships was that they needed flexibility. Sailships are of course dependent on the wind in order to move, but the wind is fickle, so pirates often relied on rowing as an auxiliary propulsion to get them into combat or escape. So optimally, the pirate ship had to be able to carry oars and have the sleek, long lines preferable for rowing. Most merchant ships had a rounder shape, better suited for carrying cargo, but less suited for cannon broadsides and rowing. Men of war, on the other hand, tended to have sleeker lines, suited for combat and rowing. There's also been a lot of talk here about big and small ships, but that can seem a bit diffuse without any point of reference. So I think it's appropriate to give a couple of examples. Vessels of the time had their size determined in tonnage, which roughly determined how much cargo they could carry. Whilst this might seem arbitrary to us landlubbers, it was important back then for determining harbour dues and such. It's always about taxes. Anyway, John Rackham, a very famous but underwhelming pirate, captained a 10-ton sloop named William. This was one of the smallest pirate vessels of the period, and akin to fishermen and tiny traders. Henry Morgan assaulted Panama City at the head of a 36-ship armada, the heaviest being his flagship, the 120-ton frigate Satisfaction, and lightest being the 10-ton Prosperous, of an undetermined type. The average tonnage of Morgan's fleet was 44. Indeed, vessels between 10 to 100 tons would have been the most common pirate ship, and also merchant vessels of the New World. But let's compare it to some bigger ships. Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, weighed in at 200 tons. The Blessed Trinity, initially a Spanish ship that escaped Morgan at Panama, and was made a pirate ship almost 10 years later, weighed 400 tons. Interestingly, she didn't carry a single cannon. East Indiaman, the large merchant ships trading in Asia, usually weighed above 500 tons, seldom more than 700. The HMS Prince, also called HMS Royal William, was one of the largest English ships of the line in the 17th century. She weighed in at around 1,500 tons. The biggest pirate ship of the period, and an extreme exception, was the former Dutch third-rate ship of the line, Gelderland, sold to the Portuguese as Nossa Senhora do Cabo, and renamed the Defense by her pirate captors. As a third-rate, she would have weighed in between 1,000 to 1,200 tons, though she didn't exactly accomplish much. She partook in the bloodless capture of her fort and was wrecked in a storm a few months later, maybe a testament to why pirates stuck to smaller vessels between 10 to 100 tons, with a few outliers weighing between 2 to 500. Pirates had multiple options on how to acquire their ships. The bigger and more heavily armed a vessel was, the more difficult it would be to acquire it, oftentimes impossible. For the most part, they couldn't just get their hands on anything. Instead, they took the best from whatever options they had, and if the option to acquire a new and better ship arose, they would take it. Ships would also deteriorate over time, from battle, from storms, or even the shipworms and other maritime infestations that dwell in tropical waters. A lot of seacraft in the period wasn't even constructed by shipwrights, simply by ordinary carpenters. However, these crafts were basic, rudimentary, at least when compared to the full-rigged merchantmen crossing the oceans or engaging in massive battles. But for the purposes of island trading, even piracy, they were quite suitable. Thus, some pirates would be able to construct their own vessels. These were usually limited to canoes and periaguas. Canoes were a single tree, halved, cut into an appropriate shape, and hollowed out. benches and oars were added, and oftentimes a single mast with a sail. They could be constructed in just a couple of days and were very flexible. They could sail just about anywhere, shallow waters, into rivers, and could even be carried overland. One could accommodate between 5 to 15 men, and armed with muskets, they were proven to defeat bigger ships when used in a fleet, and were of course used in boarding. Larger than the canoe was the periagua, which were 2 canoes cut in half and combined into a bigger vessel. These could also have 1 or 2 masts added to them, and potentially more firepower in the form of swivel guns. Privateers were also documented as constructing barks. During the period, this denoted a large variety of ships, but in this context implied what was basically a large boat with a deck added to it, and 1 or 2 masts. These vessels could even be constructed using wreckage, and unlike the canoes and periaguas, were large enough to carry proper cannons. The next method of acquisition was to purchase the ship. Those men who sailed under no nation, this was impossible, unless if they bought canoes built by native peoples, which were usually the best. Otherwise, they had no access to these civilized institutions that offered shipbuilding and auctioning services. So instead, purchasing was more common for privateers. Many of them were landholders, especially on islands like Bermuda. These gentlemen had access to properties and slaves, many of whom were employed as carpenters, metal workers, and shipwrights, meaning that the Bermudans could construct their own ships at a reasonable cost. Oftentimes, the landholders themselves would command the vessels, and have crews partly consisting of slaves. These landholder shipyards could also be contracted by the privateers, or specifically, their investors. Indeed, privateer crews and captains seldom had the money to purchase or commission the construction of a ship. Instead, they relied on the sponsorship of an investor conglomerate to create an investment pool and purchase the necessary ship and equipment. These investors would then get a share of the profits. In the Americas, it was more common to acquire smaller vessels, whereas in Europe, the modern shipyards allowed for the acquisition of bigger vessels. Unlike in the New World, however, these were seldom purpose-built for privateering. Instead, they were typically old merchantmen, men of war, captured prize ships, even fire ships, which were basically living missiles, all of them refitted for privateering purposes. The most common method of purchasing ships was at an auction. The vessels sold at auctions were usually captured by privateers and auctioned off using the inch of candle method. After proclaiming the highest price, a notch was cut into the candle. The candle was then lit and allowed to burn until a higher price was announced. If the candle burned to the mark, the ship was sold to the man who had announced it. That is the extent of legal methods in which pirates could acquire their ships. Technically, they could be given a ship or inherit or something, but this doesn't seem to have been common enough to warrant a mention. The most common method for pirates to acquire their ship was by stealing it. This could happen in 3 manners. For one, the pirates could sneak aboard a vessel when it was anchored, cut a cable, and commandeer her. This was how John Rackham stole his William. A regular ship's crew could also mutineer against the captain, thus taking the ship for themselves, electing new commanders, and becoming pirates. Lastly, if they already had a vessel, they could use it to capture a new one. This was one of the most common methods, not to acquire the first ever starting ship, obviously, but to acquire a new ship. Indeed, whilst pirates are sometimes portrayed as very attached to their vessels, think Jack Sparrow and the Black Pearl, they would more often than anyone else switch between vessels. For one, the old ship might have been damaged in a battle and require replacement. In the Caribbean, shipworms and other maritime creatures would deteriorate the wood, and they demanded constant maintenance to stay speedy, let alone seaworthy. Secondly, they might acquire a new vessel which better fulfilled the aforementioned desired properties. It was faster, bigger, could carry more stuff, etc. It is worth mentioning that a bigger ship didn't necessarily mean that it was slower than a smaller one. Pirate ships simply had to strike a balance between all of the desired properties. Good enough speed, good enough size, good enough firepower. Of course, The pirates would always modify their captured ships to better fulfill these purposes, and that is what we'll talk about next. The most remarkable modification pirates would do to their ships would be razziing, or shaving them. This included the cutting of unnecessary sections, usually the raised superstructures in the fore and back of the ship. Carved works were painted wooden statues, figurines, and even paintings found on the back of the ship, designed to impress. Galleries were balconies or sideways, protruding from the sides of the aftercastle, and completely frivolous. Pirates had little use of any of this, and by removing them, the pirates reduced weight and windage, thus improving the speed, maneuverability, and seaworthiness of their vessel. By cutting down the castles, more space was added to the decks for the musketeers to operate from. In the most extreme of cases, pirates would also knock down internal partitions, called bulkheads, used to create cabins or keep cargo from rolling around. They might also throw out anything unnecessary, like furniture and books, anything frivolous. The cutting down of superstructures and removal of galleries and decorations was iconic to pirates in the 17th and early 18th centuries. If a large ship without these features was spotted, it was sure to be a pirate. As aforementioned, rowing was part and parcel of pirate tactics, and additional oarports or scuttles could be cut into the sides, allowing more oars to be used. In a similar manner were carved gun ports, through which the pirates could fit more artillery. And captured artillery could be detrucked, removed from its carriage, plugged and waxed. The barrels kept as ballast in the bottom of the ship. When they had the opportunity to arm the artillery, the barrels were removed from the ballast, mounted onto carriages, and stuck in the gun ports. Swivel guns were essentially small cannons that were fitted onto the railings of the ship. These were an incredibly cost-effective weapon, and pirates used them as much, if not more, than regular cannons. To mount these on the ship, you first had to add a fortified pillar, called a stanchion, slapped onto the side of the ship. The swivel was then mounted on a swiveling fork, placed in a socket in the stanchion. It is not a direct modification to the ship itself, but pirates were known for having much larger crews than was required to effectively sail the ship. This was done in order to overpower their enemies in potential combat, either by arming them all with a swarm of firearms, or even in boarding and land combat. The most advanced modifications were done to the rigging, and these do not seem to have been especially common, or at least documented, probably because it was quite complicated. It included the lowering or raising or replacing of masts, and the addition or removal of sails. Rigging could be added to improve speed. This would require more men, but, as aforementioned, pirate ships were often overcrowded. On the other hand, rigging might have to be removed to make the ship easier to handle for a smaller crew, which pirates sometimes had, or if they needed to sail into, say, stormy waters. If pirates were able to capture more than one ship, and they had the sufficient crew to man both of them, the spare might be added to a fleet. The quartermaster would typically be made captain of the new vessel, and the captain of the whole company would assume the title of commodore, even admiral. Pirates would assign different roles to the ships in their fleet, and they used the following designations. The flagship or capital ship was known to them as the man-of-war. She was the biggest and most well-armed ship of the fleet. Smaller pirate vessels were known as privateers. These served as auxiliary vessels or scouts to the man-of-war. Tenders were vessels less suitable for pursuit or combat than the man-of-war or the privateers, and used instead to carry spare supplies and plunder. So as a summary, pirates desired ships that, to their best ability, were some combination of as fast as possible, had as much firepower as possible, and could carry as much crew and loot as possible. However, their ability to acquire such ships was dependent on their numbers, their weapons, and their resources. So if you're just a couple of guys stranded on a beach, you might only be able to build a canoe or a bark from shipwreck. With these canoes you can then capture a sloop, and with several sloops you could then capture a frigate with a nice rack of guns. So it was all about balancing the optimal desires with the availability of the desired, the pirates' resources, and how much they were willing to invest. Usually you would find pirates in a vessel of 20 to 100 tons, which was quite standard overall for vessels in the New World. It was uncommon to find pirate ships bigger than 400 tons, and even this was quite small compared to large East Indiamen and warships, which averaged between 500 to 700 tons. Such vessels would have been too difficult to acquire, been too unwieldy, required too many resources and men to maintain, and just weren't necessary to complete the ambitions of the pirates: get a bunch of loot and drink your black guts out. A vast variety of different ship types were used, all of whom differed in their rigging and the shape and size of their hulls. I've mentioned a couple: canoes, piraguas, barks, sloops, and frigates. And pirates used other types of vessels, like brigantines, schooners, and pinks. The most popular one was definitely the sloop, partly because this vessel was very difficult to define in the 1600s, and could imply a lot of different vessels of a similar size and seemingly hull structure, but employing vastly different riggings. Indeed, ships of the 17th century are notoriously difficult to pinpoint, and this video has largely served as a primer for my next episode, which will be a more thorough look into the many different ship types of the Golden Age, how exactly they evolved and changed meaning, how and if pirates used them, and if so, why or why not, and also some of the design choices that went into these vessels. So, stay tuned.